onto some other site that we've looked at ways that we can use JavaScript in order to redirect someone from one place to another, and if we're not careful, that JavaScript code might be able to redirect a user to some place that the user doesn't necessarily want to be. And so we'll definitely look at an example of that later on too. So that's definitely one potential vulnerability. Yeah?
So like with HTML, CSS, it is all like static, it's just like JavaScript, you can actually use it to run code on someone's machine. So if you're right, like
by looking at one potential JavaScript exploit, which is quite common, called cross-site scripting, where the idea of cross-site scripting is that we're going to try and look for a vulnerability where we can, in the same way that in the SQL case, we were able to inject whatever SQL code we wanted into being run on a database, a malicious user, if they are able to send the right link to the right person and get them to click on a link, for instance, are able to get some arbitrary JavaScript code to run inside of the user's web browser. And so let's take a look at a very simple Flask application. This is, in fact, the entire Flask application, the contents of application.py, for example. And there is, in fact, a major cross-site scripting vulnerability inside this application. Let's see if we can tease apart where exactly that is. So at the beginning, we import Flask and we import request, which we'll need access to later. We create a new Flask application inside the current module. Then we define a default route. Just when you go to the slash route, it calls this index function that returns hello world. And then down here we have app.errorhandler404. So you may not have seen this before, but Flask has built-in error handlers that are specific functions that run when specific error codes happen. So 404, you might recall, is the error code for not found when someone goes to a page that doesn't exist on the web server. And what Flask can do for you is say, you know, whenever a 404 error happens on the web server, go ahead and run this function, which is going to supposedly render my 404 error page. And you can do the same thing for error 500, for example, internal server errors, or 403 forbidden errors, or any other error status code you want. If you want particular code to run, a particular template to be displayed when a particular error code happens on your web application, you can use Flask's built-in error handler to be able to handle those particular situations. So what we have here is a function that is supposed to handle 404 errors, that handles a page not found error. It calls this page not found function, and all the page not found function is going to do is say return not found, and then it's going to append request.path, where request.path is what the URL was that the user tried to go to that resulted in the 404 error. And so what might that mean? It means that if a user goes to /foo, for example, then what's going to happen is, I'll go ahead and go into cross-site scripting, 0, and go ahead and run this web application that's running that very same code. So I get hello world when I go to the default route, don't type in anything after the URL. But if I go to /foo, for example, what do I expect to see? Great, not found : foo, because not found was the initial message that happens when I do a 404 error message, and then /foo is the path, the request path that I tried to request. And so this might be pretty typical, that if I go to a URL that doesn't exist, I probably expect a page like this to show up that says, sorry, this route, this path that you were trying to request couldn't be found on the web server. So what can go wrong there? Here's the web application. Where's the security vulnerability? Yeah. Great, exactly. So the vulnerability is with this request path, that if someone is able to inject JavaScript code into this request path, now suddenly the thing that I'm returning is not found : potentially some JavaScript code that is then going to be run. And you might imagine that if a hacker now is able to take one of these URLs and convince a user to click on a link that takes them to a URL like that, that takes them to this particular function in my Flask application, now suddenly this hacker is able to run whatever JavaScript code they want to inside of the web application. So what might that look like? Instead of just going to /foo as the route that returns a benign not found /foo on the page, what if, for instance, the user typed in this as their URL, where after the slash they type script alert hi /script and JavaScript. Now this is going to be the request path, which means what gets put into return not found : we're going to return some page that says not found, and then this JavaScript code that says alert hi.